All right, my name is Jeryn Lamberto, and today I will be going over Arizona's infrastructure report card and using the IAD framework that we've used in class to help analyze the problems and hopefully come up with some solutions. So Arizona's overall GPA is a C, which falls under the mediocre and requires attention category, but obviously, as you can see, the grades kind of vary depending on what section of the report we're looking at. So the two places that we focused on are going to be bridges, which is one of the highest rated as a B+, and then also roads, which is going to be the lowest rated at a D+. The first thing I will be getting into is bridges. Here's an example of an iconic bridge or pair of bridges in the northern part of the state called the Navajo or Grand Canyon bridges. As a state, we have done a great job at upkeeping these bridges and allowing for the transportation of goods and services throughout the northern part of the state. Although we have done a great job at creating these bridges, they are not as widely used as our road system, and we cannot get complacent as there were always going to be increasing exogenous factors such as population increase and extremely harsh weather conditions. Our road system is where we have the biggest room to grow, and also I feel like is one of the most important, if not the most important, infrastructure challenges we face here in Arizona. As shown on the slide, Arizona residents travel quite a bit in their cars every day, and yet our road system is what's lacking the most. These roads being extremely busy, paired with the fact that the city continues to sprawl further and further out, has made them almost undrivable in certain areas. Again, factors like increasing population and harsh weather conditions only add to the wear and tear on these roads. As a state, we need to look at what we can do to help fix this problem. So the American Society of Civil Engineers has listed a few big solutions in their report that Arizona could use to help fight these infrastructure problems for the future. So the first one is going to be to create a statewide database to analyze and keep track of infrastructure priorities and management. That way, people are able to access like I said, a database, so they are able to tell which places and where needs the most help. Another solution would be to increase the current gas tax to lessen the reliance on federal funding. The current gas tax hasn't been updated since the 90s, so being able to increase a tax here would allow us to put a lot more money into the places where we need them instead of having to wait and rely on federal funding and subsidies. Another one would be to educate citizens about infrastructure and talk about plans and priorities. I think this would pair really well with the first one in the database, where at least just allowing citizens to know where their money is going and at least just see what actually changes when we do things like put money into our infrastructure. And then lastly is going to be aware of the current growth rate and design around that. Currently, Arizona has one of the largest growth rates when it comes to population, so we just need to be able to design these roads sustainably and make sure that they will be able to be in use for multiple years into the future.
Hello, I'm going to be applying the Institutional Analysis and Development Framework to the infrastructure of the state of Texas. So I thought a good spot to start off with was to point out just some of the big exogenous variables that set Texas apart from any other state. So Texas has the largest inventory of bridges in the nation and the largest network of highways in the nation. And this would clearly pose quite a large funding challenge for any state. But we're going to go ahead and see how Texas handles that challenge. So the maintenance program in the state of Texas is split about 80-20, 80% from federal sources and 20% from state and local. And the 80% federal comes from this highway bridge program. And then the 20% is split between the Texas Department of Transportation, 10%, and then The other 10% is from whatever local authority happens to own the area that bridge or road resides in. Another thing the state of Texas has is this state infrastructure bank. And what the state infrastructure bank does is it sort of establishes a constitutional choice rule by determining who's eligible for funding for projects that have to do with infrastructure, roads, or bridges, and what those rules around that funding will be. Like what are the rules for the use of this money? And then just to compare Texas a little bit to the other states in this presentation, we'll start with California. This 7% versus 1.3% is the number of structurally deficient bridges. California has 7% of their bridges are structurally deficient versus 1.3 in Texas. I think there's a few reasons for this. One of the biggest ones, I think, is the exogenous variables facing California, namely earthquakes. Earthquakes is a much larger concern in the state of California than it is in Texas, and so they have to make sure that their bridges are structurally sound enough to withstand earthquakes. So that's quite a large challenge that just Texas doesn't really have to worry about. Another thing that California has that Texas doesn't really have is a funding variability. Namely, this would be the income tax. California has income tax versus where Texas doesn't have an income tax. So in California they have quite a large tax base to draw from if they need to, and this would allow them to in the future, if they needed more funding for infrastructure projects, they could draw on that. Whereas Texas, the proposition of income tax has been brought up multiple times throughout history, and it's been voted down every time. Texans just do not want an income tax, and that's actually a large reason why so many people are living here, are moving here from other states, is so they don't have to pay income tax. But what that leads to is a growing population in the state of Texas, and further predictions of population in Texas correlate to greater wear and tear on our bridges and roads. And so at some point, we're going to have to find some type of sustainable funding for the maintenance of our bridges and roads in Texas. And then to compare to Arizona, the other state in this presentation, Arizona sort of takes on a Florida model. And what I mean by that is Florida prioritizes the repair and maintenance of their bridges, and they have a notoriously very well-kept inventory of bridges and roads in the state of Florida. And the way they do that is they prioritize repair and maintenance over new constructions or replacement. They do everything they can to get the maximum amount of life out of all of their bridges. And so Arizona's done the same thing, and they've had quite a lot of success with that. Another thing is the accountability in the state of Arizona. So in Arizona, ownership of a bridge is actually what determines jurisdiction over maintenance and repair. Whoever owns the land where the bridge is going to be built at, or where the bridge resides, whatever authority owns it, whatever person owns it, that entity is responsible for the maintenance and repair of that bridge. And so that's kind of a way of delegating accountability to certain stakeholders. And then the relevance of the evaluative criteria. So the evaluative criteria we used in this presentation was the infrastructurereportcard.com. And one of the things I noticed is that there are certain cases where you would think that one state would score higher than the other, but then it's the opposite when reflected in the infrastructure report card. An example of this would be, say, Arizona has a higher bridge score than Texas does, but then at the same time, the percentage of deficient bridges in Arizona is 3%, where in Texas it's only 1.3%. So a smaller percentage of Texas's bridges are structurally deficient, but Arizona has a higher percentage of structurally deficient bridges. This would make you wonder why they scored higher on their evaluative criteria. And I think that this is the reason they scored higher is because the infrastructure report card doesn't just factor in percentage of structurally deficient versus structurally sufficient. They factor in projections of population growth, projections of wear and tear, projections of potential funding, like we brought up in the California example. All of these things are taken into account to determine what the grade is, and it's not just a simple percentage of deficient roads and bridges or sufficient roads and bridges. It's all combined into one grade. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name's Savannah and I'm going to be talking about California's infrastructure today. So overall, in terms of infrastructure, California will receive a C-, and this means that the infrastructure needs serious attention and is barely passable to be safe for civilians to use. A lot of California's current infrastructure is just not fit for the volume of people that live in the state. And this causes constant traffic and congestion in major cities like Los Angeles and San Francisco. Although it seems like there are constantly bills and amendments passed to amend some of California's major traffic issues, the challenges still remain. For the sake of this analysis, we'll be focusing on the roads and bridges of California. Local streets and roads make up around 81% of California's roadways. And unfortunately, the conditions of these local roadways are rapidly deteriorating as most of them are covered in potholes, uneven terrain that makes it unsafe for driving, and they're just not big enough for the ever-increasing population of California. The average ranking for the local roads in California is considered at risk, and a significant amount of funding is needed to get these roadways back up to standard. The bridge situation, on the other hand, is a completely different story in California. A lot of California's bridges are not adequate for the volume of people that is required, which presents major economic and safety risks. According to the League of California, bridges are typically built to last 50 years or less. That means that they'll need to be retrofitted every 50 years or so. Unfortunately, 5,544 bridges in California are more than 50 years old and in desperate need of being retrofitted. This means that they're not going to collapse at any second, but they need serious attention and they simply are not safe for people to be driving on. People should not be driving on them. Another 2,384 of these bridges are between 40 and 49 years old. So they're not quite up there, but they also need to be retrofitted. A serious investment and funding is required to retrofit these bridges, not to mention the physical labor that would be required to take on these major projects. In order to fund these projects, 60% of the funds are acquired from using bonds, while the other 40% come from funds acquired from a gas tax. The participants in this action arena are the citizens of California who pay taxes and use the infrastructure, the state of California's government who allocate funds for infrastructure projects, and the Transportation Bureau who decides which projects should be carried out. Between Texas and Arizona, I would say that California would fall in last place, just because there are so many areas of the state that are in absolute shambles. Like, there are a lot of areas that need serious attention and funding to be brought back up to standard, and it just doesn't seem like we're going to get there anytime soon. And also for California, the way that a lot of our infrastructure is paid for is through taxes and taxpayer approval. And a lot of people in California, a lot of voters are sick of paying taxes. Like, we have crazy gas taxes, crazy like state property taxes that a lot of times people are not willing to vote to improve the infrastructure of California. It's unfortunate. I honestly feel like we will not see any progress in improving the infrastructure in California without federal intervention, just because I think overall taxpayers are feeling frustrated that they're paying so much in taxes without much return. But hopefully with some federal investment in our infrastructure, we will start to see some progress in the improvement. However, every state is different. It is kind of like comparing apples and oranges, just because every state government is different, every state pays for things differently. And of course, I am a little biased as a California resident. I just think it's ridiculous how horrible our roads are, and how there has been, for example, in my neighborhood, there is a giant pothole right when you exit to get onto the main road. It has been there my entire life. It has never been fixed. So, considering that a lot of California's roads are rapidly deteriorating, I feel like it would take a major catastrophe or serious federal intervention for there to be any action to improve that particular infrastructure. It's almost like there's too many projects that need to be accomplished that it's almost overwhelming, which causes whoever's in charge to not want to do it. So that's just my personal opinion on that matter. Thanks for listening.